So I'm just a student in Singapore, and not even a very good one, right? It seems like the only thing social I can do is really social distancing. But but the one thing I can do really well is spend way too much time online. On Instagram, on Reddit, on YouTube. You know it, I've scrolled it, right? But what I've witnessed recently is something that's particularly peculiar. It seems like the movements that most proudly and loudly champion the values of inclusivity and diversity are often the ones that have the least tolerance for actual diversity of thought. I mean, it's an odd sort of theater, right? Everywhere you go in these spaces, you will see different kinds of people, but they're all saying the same words, the right opinions, the right ideas, the right preconceived notions, all in some sort of synchronized harmony. It's not like they are robotic. It's not even as if they are insincere, hopefully. Many of them are driven by a genuine desire for justice, for fairness, for a kinder world. But good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes, right? And what's missing in all of this, what's quietly being eroded, is something fundamental. The ability, the willingness, the freedom to question, to challenge, and therefore to deviate from the script. Now, we celebrate physical diversity all the time recently, in race, in language, in religion, just like our pledge, right? And these are ideals that are wonderful, right? These are ideals that we should celebrate and that we should take pride in as a society. But when it comes to diversity in thought, when it comes to ideological diversity, we see almost eerie uniformity. And I believe that this is because a culture that prioritizes inclusion and prioritizes safety can very quickly, without the proper safeguards, devolve into something far less noble. A culture of induced conformity. And this conformity isn't maintained by law or by threat of force, right? It's more subtle, it's softer, it's in a way self-imposed, right? It's something that doesn't really have to be told to them to do, right? They do it themselves, right? Whether out of fear of exile, fear of public shaming, or even fear of being labeled as an extremist, as one of them. And so a movement that was originally built on openness begins to close itself in, right? A dynamic marketplace of ideas begins to close, begins to shrink itself down into an echo chamber of preconceived notions repeated ad nauseum. And that's why we need reminders. Now more than ever, we need loud, unapologetic reminders that free expression as an ideal isn't just some lofty principle, right? It's fundamental. It's how societies evolve. It's how cultures refine themselves. It's how we as individuals unearth the truth from the comfortable illusions that we so very often wrap ourselves in. And conformity in that aspect is not just counterproductive, it is actively detrimental. But let's take a step back. Conformity has always been with us. It's almost as old as civilization itself, right? Traditional conformity is pretty easy to spot, right? Usually it's brought about by a higher state entity, right? Or governments that dictate laws, induce regulations upon the populace. Afterwards, the citizenry are expected to follow within that exact same rulebook, right? This is traditional conformity imposed from the top down. But the advent of the digital revolution and the advent of the internet and other applications has ushered in a world where we are not only bound by local law or by local customs, but also by a gaze of an hyper-connected world. A world where being offending doesn't mean just offending a few people within your society or within your region. It means risking condemnation from everyone, everywhere, all at once. And so a new form of conformity has emerged, one that I like to call performative conformity. It's not really the brute force conformity of traditional or totalitarian regimes. It's not even the more passive conformity of, say, a long-standing cultural tradition. This is a hyper-reactive, self-policing system where individuals don't necessarily just comply with dominant narratives, they anticipate them. They will shape their ideas, they will shape their opinions, and they will shape their silences to fit within that status quo. So, and in all of that sense, that is very detrimental to our human psyche and to our human cognition. Now, we move on to the next point, right? That freedom of expression and diversity of thought is the most important form of diversity, right? And there are many examples of this, right? Diversity of thought is dangerous. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it's uncomfortable. And yes, it can offend. But that's precisely why it's so powerful, right? When we sanitize the uncomfortable, what we're doing is sterilizing the profound. And the cruel irony in this notion is that this is ignored in many of the movements that try to celebrate inclusivity and diversity, and performative conformity actually becomes the norm. And there are a few reasons why, right? The first, and the major reason for that, is because they have an error in the formation of these movements themselves, in which they brandish themselves as the arbiters of moral truth. And at the same time, they tolerate difference, but only in a risk-free, pre-approved form, a risk-free form. And what happens is that the more morally righteous a movement is, the less room it will give, naturally, for dissenting voices. Because why engage with an opposing idea when you can simply brandish them when you are the moral superior, when you can simply brand them as immoral, as regressive, as heretic? But the inconvenient truth in this is that conformity doesn't really build the world at all, right? It cages it in. It builds bars around possibility. It blocks the doors behind imagination, and it leaves us pacing behind a small chamber where the only acceptable opinions are the ones that have already been approved. And the problem with this is that history's greatest minds and the world's greatest minds are only celebrated today precisely because they refuse to fit within the status quo of their situation. And there are many examples of this. But for the sake of time, I only show one example. And this one example, I believe, is pretty recent and is really pretty prevalent. And that is of Václav Havel, right? A playwright in Soviet-controlled, Soviet-influenced Czechoslovakia, who essentially, in my very brief retelling, witnessed what happens when conformity becomes absolute, right? When the state puts a cage around free thought so strong and so tight that even questioning its existence was considered treasonous. Now, Havel fought back, not with guns, but with ideas. And for that, he was imprisoned. And for that, the state tried to make an example out of him. But his defiance sparked the movement, among other things. The Velvet, as your history teachers will tell you, the Velvet Revolution spread throughout Czechoslovakia, putting back a democratic government. And the first leader that the people elected was Havel himself. Because I believe, among many reasons, that it can be summed up in one statement, that when you refuse to accept the bars of the cage that people put you in, you don't just show yourself that there were no bars to begin with, you show other people that the doors were never locked in the first place. Now, in the same vein, a society that rejects difficult conversation for the sake of unity isn't progressive in any sense. It is, in fact, stagnant, right? It is like a kaleidoscope, but every piece and every fragment and every color inside of it is the same. No matter how you twist or turn or rotate or shake it like you mean it, right? The picture inside stays the same. It's dull, it's lifeless. The true beauty behind a kaleidoscope is the way the jagged edges and the clashing shades collide and then break apart and then reform into something new, into something unexpected, but into something that is still wondrous and fantastical. That's how ideas should be. And that's how we should. Now, as thinkers, as leaders, as people who will inevitably change and shape the world in one way or another, we must recognize a fundamental truth. Real ideas, new ideas, do not survive in a climate of fear. But that's precisely the world that many of these movements are building. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but through a slow, well-meaning drift into a world where conformity and comfort masquerade as progress. And we'll keep hearing these words. We hear diversity and inclusivity repeated over and over again. But at the end of the day, words are just words. And the more they are used, the more they seem like just banners for ideological purity rather than genuine openness. What good is there in a chorus of voices if all we do is sing the same note? What good is there in a movement for social change when all we're doing in the first place is merely swapping out one form of social pressure for another? And that's why we need to reject the pressure to conform. Not in rebellion for rebellion's sake, but because nothing good, nothing new, nothing extraordinary has ever come out of people too afraid to speak their mind. When the world is too afraid to step on toes, we forget how to dance. And trust me, the world needs more dancers. Thank you.